My name is Jaelyn. I am currently I'm actually from a small community in northern Labrador called Nunatavut. I lived there with my grandparents until I was about 9 years old. And I lived a super traditional way with them, in the springtime. We went out on the land and learned a lot from them. They're a huge part of who I am. Um, and they're the foundation for who I am as well. And then when I was 9, uh, well, a couple years in between there, I was in the foster care system, and then I ended up going with my family that lives in Toronto, and they're Afro-Guyanese, and I lived in Toronto until I was 18 years old, and then I went off to university. I went to Carleton University in Ottawa, and I've been back and forth between Ottawa and Toronto ever since. Ever since then, I'm 24 now. I graduated with a bachelor's in law and Indigenous studies, and I have a 5-month-old son named Kari. So yeah, that's who I am. Shanice.
All right. Hi, everybody. Anim bonjour buju, Shanese Indoowaaboo and Dobo to go Nish Bemnang, Jack and Dodem. Nishna Bay Makade Kwe, Toronto, Dunjaba, meanwhile, Nabising Dunjaba, Debenjamin Nakuya Potawatomi. So, hello, my name is Shanese Steele. My Anishinaabe name is Indoowaaboo, which means to carry the ceremony. I'm Crane Clan. I'm Afro-Indigenous, so my father is Black and he hails from Trinidad and Tobago and Carriacou, Grenada. And then my mom is Nabising Métis or Nipissing Métis. Nabising means people of the water, and my community has been taking care of the same waterways for the last 33,000 years. I'm currently on the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people here in Decatur, Illinois. I am an activist, a writer, an educator, a Virgo, which I think is the most important thing I said out of all of those things. And yeah, I'm just someone who strongly believes in Black and Indigenous liberation and that we cannot survive in a colonial capitalistic world without each other. So yeah, I'll pass it to Kiesha.
Hey everyone, I am a Gemini. Tanse gido al kishin siya sun, gaskatu with an oigwa ni kidoni daoma, no agmagan ok mistakes agihine, kigwa machus moni, kigwa ni sepich okchi widow. My name is Kiesha, and as I mentioned, I'm a Gemini, which is, I think, also the most important thing. I'm from Toronto originally, but I was raised in Southern Ontario, and then I moved to Austria when I was 10 years old. When I was 14, I moved back to Turtle Island. I lived in El Paso, Texas for 2 years, and then I moved back to the Southern Colonial State, Canada. I am Afro-Indigenous. My mom is Jamaican. She was born and raised in Jamaica, and she migrated to Canada in her late teens. And my father is from a reserve in northern Saskatchewan, but he was part of a 60 scoop, and they met in Sarnia, Ontario on Anishinaabe land. So about myself, I am currently in my last class for completing my major in Indigenous Studies. And yeah, I don't do much besides that. Yeah, I'm gonna pass it off to Amber.
Heshte, Estongo, Amber, Chehochapkados, Muskogogi, Doez, Lishtogi, Doez, Amalagida, Lojagogi, Moment, Amadowa, Lojapoga. Hi everyone, my name is Amber. I'm African American and I am Muskogee. I'm also of Shawnee, Yuchi, Quapaw, and Cherokee descent. My tribal town is Lojapoka, or the place where turtles dwell, and my clan is Turtle Clan. I'm currently living in Portland, Oregon on Kalapuya territory. And let's see about me. I am a lot of things: a mother, a small business owner. I say activist because that's like the formal way people know to call people who talk about this stuff often. But really, I'm interested in the ways in which Black natives get to experience our Blackness and our indigeneity equally, where we learn to decompartmentalize from like ideas about who we have to be or how we have to show up in the world. And I really like to critique ideas around settler colonialism and white supremacy and challenge Indigenous people to not perform or participate in these like colonial ideas of existing in the world and us not being afraid to be dynamic. And yeah, but I think the heart of my work is to really empower and create safe spaces for Black Natives, and making sure that we don't feel like we have to ask permission to exist in a really anti-Black world, especially within the Indigenous community. So that's who I am. So maybe we should jump into the conversation. We have been, I think all of us have been having this conversation in our lives for, in every kind of situation. But I think that we really today wanted to talk about Afro-Indigeneity, what that means to us, what our experiences have been like. We want to talk about maybe pressures we felt, and then what is the future like for Afro-Indigenous people, for Afro-Indigeneity, for indigeneity. And so I think we're just gonna have a chat. We're gonna have a conversation about what all that means and what that looks like in our lives. So maybe we should all start off with what does it mean to be Afro-Indigenous? And since I'm talking, I might as well. So I think Afro-Indigenous to me, like sometimes it can sound super academic to say Afro-Indigenous. I think most of the time I'll say I'm Black and Native, or I'm Muskogee and Black, or Black and Muskogee, as a way to center or position my indigeneity within my Muskogee identity, which I'm still learning about. So I grew up away from my tribe, geographically separated and even culturally separated. And I always knew that I was Muskogee, or as my dad would say, we're Creek. But I didn't have an idea what that meant. And so I think as I've grown older and really sought it out myself, especially after my dad died, I think that there was a sense of longing and a sense of belonging that I needed as a way to connect to him, because I felt like there was just this cavern that I couldn't cross. And I think my grandmother is the one who really helped me, after my dad died. I asked her, I said, I just want to know everything. I want to know who I am. And it sucks that I feel like I'm asking this so late in my life. And it's my grandmother who has really walked me home in a lot of ways. And I think that for me, that's what being Afro-Indigenous means, is the relationship we have to people in our lives who are both Black and Native, right? For me, it's about honoring both of my peoples, and not choosing who I'm worthy of existing as, right? There is no conflict, and I say this often, there's no conflict in my blood or in my being about who I am and where I come from. I think a lot of the resistance that I experience comes from the outside. And so for me, being Afro-Indigenous, or being Black and Native, or specifically Black and Muskogee, has to do with the people I come from and the relationships I have. And so as someone who's reconnecting, I feel like my number one priority is to be in community and in relationship to the peoples that I come from. So I think it's not a really simple answer, but I think that it's not a blanket term for me. Yeah, it definitely is rooted in being with my peoples, both of them. So yeah, anybody else want to go next?
Yeah, I can go. I 100% agree on that. I think when it comes to what is Afro-Indigenous, it's something that I've been struggling with a lot as I get older, because I feel like throughout my life, I always tried to be one or the other. It felt like both couldn't exist within me. But as I've gotten older, I've really come to a place of trying to find what that balance is and what it means to be within a Black and Indigenous body. And so Afro-Indigenous, I think, is also just a term. I feel like it's those of us who fit within communities trying to find a term that makes sense to other people. Even when I think of the term Afro-Indigenous, for me, I feel like I'm trying to explain why I belong in the community that I belong in. At the end of the day, I'm Anishinaabe. I'm Anishinaabe Métis, and for me, it's like my Blackness doesn't matter in that. Like, and when I say it doesn't matter in that, I mean, like, it doesn't take away from who I am as an Anishinaabe Métis person. It doesn't make my relationship to my community any less. It doesn't like shift how my ancestors feel about me or how I feel about my ancestors. But it feels like when I'm saying I'm Afro-Indigenous, I'm trying to explain to them, like, I can't just sit here and say I'm Anishinaabe, because people are going to look at me and they're going to say Anishinaabe and what? Like, I can't, like, and I think that's the hard thing for me is like, I love the term Afro-Indigenous, and I really feel like it gives us a chance to connect with others who share that lived experience. But for me, it's like, I shouldn't have to say I'm Afro-Indigenous. I should just say I'm Anishinaabe, or I should just say I'm Trinidadian, like trying to find a term that makes sense to other people. Right. And I think that's why I've been struggling as I get older with the term Afro-Indigenous, because it's not that I feel disconnected from it. It's just like, I want to be able to walk into community and simply just be me. Like, I shouldn't have to explain to you why I look the way that I look. Like, you should see me and be like, they're Anishinaabe. And that's it. Like, that should be where it begins and where it ends. Right. But I feel like as Black folks, as Black presenting folks in Indigenous communities, we too often have to explain why we're there, why we're accessing things, why we're connecting, why we're on the land, like all of these things that oftentimes like other folks don't have to explain. Like, they get to just show up and be their nation, right? And like, I feel like oftentimes even the parts of me that I identify with like different things always get prescribed to like my specific race. Like, for instance, like my eyes, and I've shared this with like folks before, but like my eyes are seen as something that comes from my Anishinaabe side, but they don't. They come from my Black side, right? But there's this like also this assumption that my features are also less Black because of the fact that I'm Anishinaabe. But like, my features, like when I look at my Black family, my features are my Black family. Just a lot of people don't understand that, right? They have this like very precise idea of what A, indigeneity is supposed to look like, and B, what Blackness is supposed to look like. And because my features fall to them in a certain area, like they also are disconnecting me from my other roots. And so I feel like it's complex. Like, in moments I feel completely Anishinaabe and completely Black and completely both in a moment. And then other times I feel like people are trying to dissect me to make me make sense in their eyes of like how I am Anishinaabe, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to a little bit of what Shanese is saying. Eyeline Bird, she had put up on her Instagram that we need to unpack why in Indigenous communities we're so comfortable with our proximity to whiteness, as opposed to, you know, folks being Afro-Indigenous. And like Shanese said, I think I've struggled a lot with, actually, I think growing up, I guess I should take it back. Growing up in my community, I was always seen as Inuk. Like, Inuk means person, Inuit means people, right? So I always saw myself as just a person. I didn't see myself as, I knew I was Inuk, and that's the degree to what I thought. And I knew I was Black as well when I was younger, but it wasn't something that I had really thought about to that extent until I left my community. I think a huge part of that is also, you know, I'm Black presenting, but I'm also very light skinned. And they're also, I take on my Anon-6 features. So I take on a lot of those Inuk features. So my, me being Inuk wasn't challenged as much as opposed to, and I've spoken to this with my sister's permission, my older sister, she's, if you see her, she's much darker than me, and she had a really hard time in my community. She, I just remember growing up, and people would call her, you know, the N-word all the time. And this is like, and it was really conflicting for me, I think, growing up, because I love my sister so much. And I just saw people who, like my own people and people who I also love so much, just, you know, completely shredding her apart. And now our experiences are much different. She ended up leaving our community, and I think that, you know, like, for example, I can go to her and I can speak some Inuktitut with her, and she loves that. But at the same time, she has kind of, I think, stepped away from being Inuk, and I think it hurts her in a way. Whereas my experience has been a little bit different. But like I said, until I left my community, I didn't really, why are you trying to eat my shirt? I didn't really experience the I guess a lot of those, oh, you're not Inuk until I left. So when I moved to Ontario, it was really confusing for me because I had people saying to me, you're light skinned. And I was like, what is that? Like, I didn't understand, any of those different, I guess, terms and nuances and different in my other communities that really existed. And so as I got older, I lived in the suburbs of Toronto, which was really hard. And because there was no other Inuit around, and also Inuit are so, I think one thing is Inuit are so often left like I feel like in the backdrop and left in pan-Indigeneity, and we're such a distinct people with a distinct culture. And so moving to Toronto, I remember was really hard because there was no centers for me. There was no support. There's no cultural support there for Inuit. There was, at the time, there was like some First Nations programs, but I'm not First Nations, right? I'm Inuk. And then it was also really confusing because I remember I would step into places with my auntie and they'd be like, they'd be really confused because you see this like mixed child. And then, my aunt who was a Black woman who raised me. And there was, from when I was young, I was caught in a situation where I understood that, the world wasn't going to adapt to me or try to understand who I was. And so from very young, I started to kind of, I guess, put it away. I started to put my Inukness away. And I started to kind of become more digestible for people. And that's something that I continued to do until I think I actually found a community of Afro-Indigenous people who made me feel like, wow, like, there's other people like me, like I exist in the world. And yeah, it's been a really tough journey. And just like entering spaces and always being challenged, like, oh, are you Inuk? Oh, what else are you? Whereas I feel like a white and Inuk person never really gets those questions. They don't get those uncomfortable stares. It's like Blackness is almost so foreign to some of my community members, which hurts a lot because I feel like whiteness isn't, right? And yeah, this is something I've struggled with. But there's also so much acceptance also within Inuit communities. If you go to a Iqaluit, people aren't really asking you what you are. That's not really a question. But again, it varies on the community. Inuit Nunanga is made up of 4 different regions. And there's anti-Blackness, I think, in all those communities, but at the same time, there's also a huge majority of Inuit who are extremely accepting. And so, yeah, my Afro-Indigeneity is very strongly connected to, I always make it very specific, like I'm Inuk, I'm Guyanese, like that's who I am. I try to steer away from, pan-Indigenous and any, I guess, pan-Indigenous terms and any overall terms because being Guyanese and being Inuk is a very unique experience, and it speaks to who I am and how I navigate my way around this world.
I guess I will go last. So for myself, I do prefer to say like I'm Jamaican, well, Afro-Caribbean or part of the African diaspora and Cree, rather than using the term Afro-Indigenous for like the similar like reasons that y'all have brought up because it's super pan-Indigenous. And as Amber said, like I want to position myself in my nationhood and in being Cree because, my responsibilities are to my people, are continuing Nehilowiwin, my language, learning my traditions, and they're very specific to like my nation and to my location. So for me, I've never really questioned the term Afro-Indigenous. I thought, I love the term because it was somewhere that I fit in myself as being somebody who's visibly Black. Until like I started to notice how, folks who are mixed with white are just so easily accepted and don't have to create this new term for themselves. And I feel like a lot of pressure is coming from like externally, but also it's coming from internally. I didn't grow up, Black or Native. I grew up raised by a white stepdad since I was 2-3 years old, and I grew up, around predominantly white people in Southern Ontario and in Europe. So I wasn't raised as somebody who was really strongly connected to my Black side or strongly connected to my Native side. So when Amber said that, I was like very it was about like the relationship and kinship you have with both of your ancestors and like your communities. You know, I feel like that's something I've been longing for, and that's what really started my journey in reconnecting to, you know, to being Cree. You know, I was disconnected through my dad being part of the 60 Scoop and put into foster care. And I've never really actually even tried to really reconnect to my Blackness, because it's not something I've really felt the need to reconnect to, because like I'm visibly Black, I experience anti-Blackness. So I never thought I really needed to, you know, reconnect, but that's something that, you know, I hopefully will start reconnecting to as well. I'm so sorry. There's just like so many things in my mind from what y'all have said, and I'm trying to like process and, you know, you really like, I don't know, even grasp like things that all of y'all have said. But yeah, for me, you know, it's sad that we have to create a new term for us, because we cannot just be seen simply as, you know, part of our nations and Native. Yeah, I feel like that's all I have said. Does anybody else want to contribute to that question, or do we want to move on to the second one?
I was going to say that I think, yeah, I think it's interesting how we feel like we always have to kind of position ourselves, maybe not in opposition, but as something in response to white indigeneity. Like that feels like a replication of the system that we all are trying to dismantle in the first place. But I also think that we should celebrate the language that we choose for ourselves as a way to embrace, you know, our heritages, right? Like I think language is something that ever evolves, and I think that saying Afro-Indigenous wasn't something that was placed on us, but something we have been choosing, and I think that that could change and might change. But I do think it has also, like listening to all of you, it sounds like what we want to be mindful of is it not becoming pan-Indigenous, but that it doesn't become something that then people just start saying without reflecting on like the responsibility to the communities that we come from, like the specific communities that we come from. And so, yeah, I want to celebrate the fact that we choose to celebrate our Blackness, and that I feel like that's where that term came from, because I can't imagine like white natives saying like, I'm European Indigenous. Like it would sound so, it would sound so ridiculous, right? Because they're not having to respond to the same kind of things that we have to respond to being Black bodies. And so, yeah, I struggle with like worrying about how people will then, you know, especially folks who are not sure of their ancestry, they just use Afro-Indigeneity to just like say like I'm also Black and Native, but they don't necessarily know their tribes. And so it then becomes like a safe term that people can use without having responsibility. So like I worry about that, but I also want to celebrate the fact that we have found community in one another when there wasn't, you know, as Jaelyn said, when there wasn't anyone to like recognize that we exist in these like dual identities. I think it's really like, I'm proud of us for creating spaces and community when we often don't have it within our own communities.
Yeah, I think like, I guess my response is going to be like to what you just said, and then also to the next question, which is like, what are your experiences as a Black presenting person in Indigenous community? Like for me, I think it's interesting, like when you say that, and like what Kiesha had said about like white people not having, or white Indigenous folks not having to create a term. Like there was no term for them to be like you said, like, oh, I'm Euro-Indigenous, right? Like I'm sure maybe like the Sami people might refer to themselves as that, but like there's no term for regular, you know, Canadian whites to like add that to their term. And I think it's just like when I think of what it meant or what it has meant to move through Indigenous communities as a Black presenting person, is like I oftentimes feel like I'm afraid that I'm being used as like a token, Because I see that happen a lot where like organizations will be like, oh, we want to talk about Afro-Indigenous solidarity, or like not Afro-Indigenous, like Black and Indigenous solidarity. You're Afro-Indigenous, so I'd love for you to come and talk about this. And it's like, I feel like to some folks, I'm like a check mark for all. Like I'm Black, I'm Indigenous, I'm queer, I'm fat, I'm a femme. And it just feels like you're just like checking off reasons to have me on panels or have me talk about these things. And it's not because you actually care about my lived experiences, it's because I'm just like a check mark. And so I have a fear of that sometimes. And like, I'm also afraid that sometimes my community uses me as like this stepping stone to have hard conversations that they're not actually willing to have with Black people, or that they're not willing to have with Indigenous folks. Like, it's like, because I'm easier, right? Like, because I fit in both worlds, it's just easier than having to confront your own anti-Blackness. Like, I'll never forget, I was sitting with a friend's mom and I was talking about how like being of Caribbean descent or being of African descent, I've been like triply displaced. Like my ancestors were displaced from Africa to Carriacou, from Carriacou to Trinidad, from Trinidad to here, right? And so like, when we talk about displacement from land, it's never talked about in that context. It's never talked about in looking at that. And my friend's mom was like, oh, I would have never thought about that. But then also admitted that she had never had a conversation with a Black person. And it's just like, it was easier to talk to me about it because I also kind of feel like sometimes our community like uses us as a shield to their ignorance. Like if they ask an ignorant comment, we'll be more understanding because we're a part of the community. And we're like, oh, I get it. You don't understand in residential schools. And I know why you're like this and blah, and we'll start making excuses where if you say something extremely anti-Black to a Black person, they're not going to give you the spoons. Like they're not going to give you the space. Right. And so like, sometimes I find myself like being extremely harmed by community because they don't have the same kind of care around me when they're asking those hard questions, when they're wanting to have conversations about anti-Blackness in the community. Like I had a friend once talk to me about how her family is extremely anti-Black and how it's affecting her mental health right now because she's afraid to have the hard questions with them because she might lose family members. And she asked me that in the middle of like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and like Regis Paquette and all of these things. And I was like, you're asking my Black ass to sit here and tell you it's okay to not confront your anti-Black family because you don't want to lose them. Like, we're losing our lives. Like, your mental health's affected. I can't log onto something without seeing a dead Black body. Like, and in that moment, I was just like, you had no care for me. And your assumption was because I'm also half Native that like, I'm going to be able to empathize with you. And I don't, because I've lost family members because of my Blackness. And so it's just like, those are some of the things that I think are hard about moving through this world. Like, obviously, of course, there's anti-Blackness and all of these other things and systemic racism and institutionalized discrimination. Like, we can talk about that till we're blue in the face. We know anti-Blackness is in the Native community. We know that. But I think like sometimes we forget to talk about like the harder stuff, the stuff that like that isn't blatantly anti-Black. Right. And then same vice versa with our Black family. Like, sometimes we aren't like they're not willing to acknowledge stuff that's inherently anti-Indigenous, right? Because, and then also like here comes the oppression Olympics that happens a lot of times, right? And then also when we get into the conversation of land back, and then Black folks are like, well, where am I supposed to go? Like, and especially for Black folks, like, I think for you, Amber, you can relate to this. Like, your Black family has been in the United States for probably around 200 to 400 years. Like, and my friend, my like past roommate and friend asked a really good question. They were like, okay, if Black people are supposed to leave too, are we supposed to just dig up our ancestors? Like, are we supposed to take them out of the ground and bring them with us? Because like, unlike white folks, when we bury our kin in these lands, like there's ceremony to that. Black folks have ceremony to burial. Right? Like white folks are like, hey, I'm going to go to the funeral home. They're going to embalm them. Cool. Peace. Like we have ceremony around how we put our ancestors in the land. And so it's like, where does that leave Black folks in that conversation? And also like when we talk about 10 acres and a mule, the question is, but whose land, whose 10 acres are we giving up? Right? And then does that go to like, okay, the nations that own slaves, they give up their land? But like, what does that even mean? Like, and so for me, it's just like, I feel like sometimes, even when I'm talking about Black liberation on these lands, there's so many things that I think Black people absolutely deserve. Like, we deserve reparations. And like, if your family's been working the same land for 400 years and bled on those lands and were beaten to the point that you couldn't walk to harvest those lands, you have a deeper connection to that land. And for me to say you have to be removed from that, like, it doesn't make sense in the same way that I wouldn't ask an Anishinaabe person to rip themselves from the land. Like, Black folks on these lands, like, our connection is much deeper than simply we live here. It's much deeper than, okay, we were slaves here. Like, we have blood connection to the land. It's obviously not in the same way that like Indigenous folks from these territories have, but it's there. And like, I just feel like sometimes it's hard trying to navigate, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean for our Black families to have blood connections to land that doesn't belong to them? And where do you go from there? Sorry, I feel like I've been like going off for a little bit, but yeah, that's just like where I'm at around that.
Can I respond to that? Just because my brain is like firing off of, being a descendant of enslaved folks here. And then the complications with like my tribe being one of the tribes that participated in chattel slavery. And then we also have our own freedmen, issues going on. I want to say I made a post a while ago because I was just thinking about, the like connection to land. And I've been thinking about like my reconnecting journey as me walking back home. Because my ancestors were forced on the Trail of Tears, my Native ancestors were forced on the Trail of Tears from Alabama and Georgia to Oklahoma. And my reconnecting journey has, for me, been about the walk back, and seeing that as like my responsibility to go back, right? But also thinking about my Black ancestors who were on the, so my Native ancestors were forced off so that my Black ancestors could work the land. And I was just thinking about, how the land saw my Black ancestors, recognize their indigeneity, and like held their feet up while they had to work. And every drop of blood that, a cotton plant pricked, it absorbed it and it remembered them, right? And so I feel like the land knows and has, understands my Black ancestors to be Indigenous. I feel like non-Black natives need to catch up with that, right? And so when we're talking about reparations, one, I think that reparations is owed to African Americans by the settler state. However, I also think that reparations are owed to Black freedmen of the tribes from the tribes, because one of my friends, Ian, talks about how enslaved folks of the tribes weren't necessarily African American, but they were African Muskogee or African Cherokee because they came from those nations specifically. And so that is where then the reparations is due, right? And so to understand it in that way, it really like shook my brain. And I was like, oh, wow, I never even thought about their nationhood as part of like our tribes. And so I do think that it's important to understand which nations owe who reparations. And so when we talk about 40 acres and a mule, I don't think it is Native people or Indigenous people's responsibility to pay back the harm that the settler state has paid, right? But I do think that for tribes that did participate in chattel slavery, it is their responsibility. The least we could do, and this is the problem that one of the problems we're having in my nation right now, is that we don't recognize kinship as an authentic form of indigeneity. And I think that the least we can do is extend kinship to our the descendants of the folks we enslaved as a tribe, and to understand that we benefited from, stealing labor and stealing lives. And the conversations that are happening right now are really rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-Black tropes about, they just want to take our money, they just want to take our resources. And it's like, that's not us practicing kinship. And to think that a lot of the descendants aren't also blood is also problematic, right? So I think what you just said is so important, is that like people, they hear us talk about anti-Blackness, but they don't see like the real harm, what anti-Blackness then equates to, like the real harm that we experience when we say anti-Blackness. And so I feel like, and this is part of one of our other conversations, is that I feel like then us Black natives are then held responsible for those fights. And we get put in positions where we have to then sacrifice ourselves, not sacrifice relationships to non-Black relative or non-Black Native relatives, or the other way, non-Native, Black folks. It's like we are put in positions where we feel like we have to become martyrs, right? And it's like that shouldn't be, like my non-Black Muskogee relatives, they should recognize the harm that happened to our freedmen, right? And that we should be responsible to that. We shouldn't be wanting to replicate colonial systems. And so, I think that that's so important for us to expand when we talk about anti-Blackness, like what that means, because I think people are getting used to hearing anti-Blackness, but they don't know the specific violence of anti-Blackness. And there's definitely been in times recently where I feel like I've had to carry some of these burdens, and I know that people then may not want me to come to ceremony, or they're telling me you're just choosing those people because you're Black. I absolutely am informed by my Blackness. My politics absolutely have a lot to do with how I think about being Black and also being Native. Just like if anyone started talking crap about Native folks, my indigeneity is going to show up. My politics of being Indigenous are going to show up. And so, I just think that like we have these instances where we're experiencing violence and people just expect us to deal with it. Like, there it is, and that's really hard when you're trying to also speak to like liberation for both of our peoples, right? It's like, how are we gonna talk about liberation when you're still willing to let anti-Blackness slide, to let the harm to Black natives slide for the sake, like you're willing to forfeit your Black Native relatives for the sake of Indigenous sovereignty? That's unacceptable, right? And you're willing to let your Black relatives, endure violence for Black liberation. Like that's what we mean when we talk about anti-Blackness or, anti-Indigenous erasure and things like that. So I really felt that.
I feel like I can't really answer the question because I haven't really thought of it outside of I haven't really thought of anti-Blackness outside of my own experiences of being questioned with by Native folks. So I feel like I can't really contribute anything to this conversation. But I feel like what y'all have said is really opening up my mind to non-Black, non-Native, non-Native to this land Black folks experience of anti-Blackness, because I've never really actually thought of that outside of my own experiences. But in terms of my own experiences, a lot of the anti-Blackness that I experienced from other Indigenous people is obvious questioning of my indigeneity and stuff like that. So I don't know if I really can contribute.
I think that a lot of the, I guess, anti-Blackness I've experienced in my communities has a lot to do with visibility. I've noticed that, so for example, if there's campaigns for things, or if there's anything that having to do with visibility, even if it's art, pictures, campaigns, commercials, whatever it may be, I've noticed that, sorry. I've noticed that people in my community are almost hesitant to include me or other Afro-Indigenous folks. And I'm not sure, I've never really responded to it because it's hard to call it out when it's so kind of implicit. And then again, I've tried to call it out before, but I've also gotten the, angry Black girl, which usually, you know how it comes. The angry Black girl thing, or the I'm aggressive, or too straight up. And with Inuit, there's always this stereotype with us that we're supposed to be very docile and quiet, and some Inuit are, but that also I think is almost like a double barrier to why sometimes I'm so. I guess I've noticed myself trying to make myself digestible in certain situations, instead of you know, just speaking it and saying it how I want. But there are, again, there's so many nuances, like it not being so blatant, it being kind of hidden. And I've also experienced, I guess, you know, like the same what everybody else kind of said, the questioning of Portuguese is the term for Black person in Inuktitut. It actually means Portuguese person. My grandmother laughs about it all the time. And she's, yeah, it means Portuguese person. And the reason that term was used was because when, you know, the up north was colonizers were going up north, they were bringing Black Portuguese folks. And so they refer to Black people as Portuguese. So yeah, I've had people, you know, say, in Inuktitut call me like a Black Inuk person, and I can never. Sometimes I feel like I can never just be referred to as like I'm Inuk. Like it's just you know, girls with curly hair. I get that a lot in Inuktitut as well. And yeah, I think that it's kind of made me in past years kind of dim myself down a little bit. And try to be less quiet and kind of just try to get in the room and get out. And I don't think until recently, you know, having conversations, like hearing Shanese talk or having conversations with my other Afro-Indigenous friends, that I realized like the inherent anti-Blackness that I experience when I walk into rooms, and the questioning and the looks I get, and just the complete like imposter syndrome I feel in a lot of those environments. And my go-to is to always call my Anansi. And she always tells me like you're Inuk, like don't let anybody make you feel like you're not Inuk. You're Inuk. You're Inuk. But I also, it's just when you're actually in the situation, it's so I found it so difficult. And I actually find myself unintentionally making more space for white and Inuk persons in whatever space that I'm in, because I almost, even within myself, I have this like underlying, I guess, ideology that they're more entitled to claim their Inukness than I am, which is like something I think I'm trying to internally unpack as well. And like I said, I'm not sure if it's because of like, there's just so many like different layers to it, but I think that's some like the really basic anti-Black experiences that I have. But again, like I'm also like a lighter skin, so I also think to like my older sister who had such a hard, difficult time, and it just turned her away from her Inukness altogether. And so, but then I also think about some other Afro Inuk folks I know who live in Nunavut, and they are like very like well respected, and I don't think they experience it so blatantly. And that has a lot to do with like histories of communities and you know, colonization and things like that. But yeah, I think that's all I can really say to this question. I'll actually ask the next question as well. So I think this is sorry. I think this is a really good one. What pressures do you feel in your communities?
I can go. Oh, go ahead, Kiesha. Go ahead.
I feel like a lot of pressures. Shanese, you mentioned it earlier, like feeling like I have to be like, you have to be one or the other. I also feel like I always have to either be, you know, Black and be pro-Black and be just like extra Black, or like the stereotypes around what Blackness is, or I have to be extra Native, you know, wear my ribbon skirt, wear beaded earrings, you know, learn my language, speak my language. And I struggle to like balance that both. I struggle to balance actually being both Black and Native, even in terms of who I date. For the longest time, you know, I've been struggling around, you know, who I date, and you know, my partner being somebody who's a white Native, who's white and Métis. When I entered university, it's when I really started reconnecting to being, you know, Caribbean, Afro-Caribbean, and being Native. And my first few years of university, I was like obsessed with like Caribbean folks, and I only dated Caribbean men at that time. I was also very like like internally homophobic, like I'm pansexual. And then, you know, following that, I only dated Native men. And then following that, I only wanted to date, you know, black Native men. And, you know, they turned out to be some of the most harmful and like abusive relationships that I've ever been in, because they're carrying like double the amounts of trauma because of both of their ancestries. So I've always found myself like my identity issues coming out through who I date, and like, trying to like fit into like, you know, I have to, you know, date somebody who shares a homeland with me. You know, my current partner, you know, his homeland also intersects with my own homeland. And I feel that's easier because of like potentially a future kid growing up on our homelands. So yeah, I don't think I really answered the question fully, but I feel like I've struggled a lot in terms of actually holding both those identities simultaneously.
I think you most definitely answered it correctly, like, because I'm about to bounce off what you said, so it clearly was correct. But yeah, I think like the pressure around dating was a huge one when I was younger, like especially in my early 20s, like my late teens, early 20s. I was like, I have to be with a Native man, and I have to specifically be with a Native man who's like full status, like 6'1", because like in Canada, we have like our status is like 6'1", 6'2". So we don't really do blood quantum. I know like some nations do blood quantum on like whether or not you're allowed to vote within like within band and council, chief and council. But like to actually get your status card, there's like 6'1", 6'2", and that's broken down between like whether or not you're being seen as full Native or half Native. And like because I'm someone who doesn't have status, like I'm Métis, and there's also just a lot of complications in my family around like birth certificates, and like folks were born in certain areas that like aren't called the same thing anymore. You know, we all know all the complications around like trying to get recognized. And so it's like, while I have my Métis citizenship, when it came to like having status, that's something that I don't have. And I really wanted my children to be able to be raised in community. And I think it's also just because the way I thought of community when I was younger was very different. Like if you were to ask me when I was younger, I would say I was raised Black, like Afro-Caribbean, 100%. Weirdly enough, by my Native mom. But like, if you ask me, I was like, I was raised Afro-Caribbean. But I also was raised on the land. And I think I didn't realize that. Like my grandparents, they were able to buy a piece of land up in Mississauga territory. And I spent a lot of my summers on the land with my Indigenous family. Like I went hunting, I went fishing, I was out on the water, I was like freaking catching grasshoppers and crickets in little cages that my papa would get us. Like my family would bet on like when we thought spring was coming, because whoever guessed when the frogs would croak first. And that's like a very Anishinaabe around the lakes like teaching of like when the frogs croak, that's when spring starts. And so like, and when you have your first thunderstorm and things like that. And so like I was raised Anishinaabe, and I was raised with like being on the land, but didn't realize it because at the time my grandparents weren't as vocal about being Indigenous, right? Because they grew up in a very different time, and my mom didn't really talk about it. And so it's like I was Indigenous without saying, oh, I'm Anishinaabe or oh, I'm Métis. Like I have pictures of my ancestors like fiddling in the kitchen. Like we grew up Métis and Anishinaabe, but I just like couldn't see it at the time, right? And also just because I didn't have the words to describe myself. Oh, not my alarm going off. I think a lot of us like have also experienced that, right? Like we are finding the terms that describe us now because we didn't have access to language and all of that. And so like growing up, I just like felt like I wasn't Native enough, so that when I started to like learn more about my Native ancestry, I was like, I have to be this 100%. And I also kind of felt like, well, I was raised Black up until like 15. So if I spend the next however many years solely focusing on being Native, I'm like making up for lost time, right? And then I started dating a Native man who was Mohawk and Cree. And unfortunately, that relationship was abusive. And because there was a lot of generational trauma, you know, grandparents being in residential school, like all of these things. And so I then started making a lot of excuses in that time period when I was in abusive relationships, because I was trying to excuse the trauma and all of that. And I felt like I have to excuse it. Like I have to be the perfect Native woman. Like I, you know, like when we go out on the land, like I'm cooking, I'm cleaning, I'm doing all of these things. Like I have to be that. And then also just knowing that like my partner's family was anti-Black, I wanted to erase my Blackness so that they would accept me, so that they would see me as a partner willing to be with their child, with their family member. And then it was like my ex decided to call me the N-word and my family the N-word. And it was like this whole thing. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. And that was like a whole thing. And then I, in that moment, was like, I'll never date another Native person again. And also during that time, I was facing a lot of like anti-indigeneity in like my community, or sorry, anti-Blackness in my community from Indigenous folks. And so like, I just like completely separated myself from community. And then I was like, well, because there's all this anti-Blackness in the Native community, I've got to go hella hard on my Blackness. And then I went back into like that hardcore identity. And I felt like I was constantly like in a battle of myself because I felt the pressure to like be the perfect Black person or the perfect Native person. And it's hard. Like it's extremely hard because you want to fit into community. And I don't care if you're mixed or not. You could be full Native, you could be full Black, and you're still going to feel that pressure, right? We just feel it sometimes double because of the fact that our identities intersect. And so that was a really big pressure. And then something else that I've like felt as I've gotten older and more comfortable in my identity is like the pressure to be a certain type of respectable because of the fact that I'm Black and Indigenous. And like, we don't have the space to make mistakes and we don't have the space to be free in our identities. And so like, I smoke weed, I smoke blunts, listen, sometimes I can't get through the week without a blunt. I'm sorry. I live a stressful life. I want to relax. But even saying that out loud is hard because I know that like folks devalue what I have to say as an Anishinaabe person, especially when it comes to spirituality because of the fact that I smoke, right? And I'm seen as not for Anishinaabe people, we call it walking the red road. I'm seen as not walking the red road because I drink and I smoke. As a Caribbean person, as specifically a Trinidadian person, rum is a big part of our culture. For me to not drink rum is like, that's also separating myself from my community. And I don't mean it in the sense that like, I need to be like blackout drunk. I mean like when rum comes out and my family's using this as a time to connect and we're talking and we're having a couple drinks and, you know, and like also just the fact that like for like a lot of African-American folks, cotton was a thing. For me, like sugarcane and making rum, like my ancestors put their blood, sweat, and tears into like cultivating that sugar cane. And so like drinking rum, that's something that we put out for our ancestors. So like when I was starting ceremony and specifically Black ceremony, I was having a hard time because I was using tobacco, which is often used for altars, with alcohol. And being Anishinaabe, I was like, you can't do that. So then I felt the pressure of like, well, I'm not honoring my Anishinaabe identity and my cultural identity in the ceremonies I practice. And so oftentimes I think there's like a pressure still to be like that perfect image of Black and Native, like don't be drunk, don't be sexual, because God forbid Black and Indigenous folks be sexual. And that's also from like outside of the community, but also within. Because like as a Black woman, if I'm overtly sexual, I'm seen as like being a hoe, being a thought, being all of these things. As an Indigenous woman, if I'm overtly sexual, it's seen as an insult to missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? And so it's like this weird space of oftentimes feeling like I can't just be me because who I am are these things that like my community are scared of being because of the way in which we've been oppressed. Like a lot of Indigenous women don't want to be overtly sexual because of the fact that we have missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we're cut off from our sexuality. And so like those are the pressures that I personally feel is like now still trying to be the perfect Black or Indigenous person or a Black Indigenous person. Like there's a pressure to not let my community down, especially since I do public speaking and activism. Like, I feel like there's the added pressure that I can't be seen as any of the stereotypes that are attributed to my community. And that's hard, especially when like, shit, I just want to enjoy life. Like, who doesn't?
I think everything that y'all are saying is so relatable. Like I said, when I was younger, I grew up with my Anansi, my Atatsiak, so my grandparents. And I grew up super, you know, proud, super proud to be Inuk, like speaking my language. And I think because my Anansi went to residential school and a lot of that was taken out of her, she really instilled it in me. And you know, I remember even when I was younger, like, not wanting to be Halunaq, which is like white, and at all. I was like, no, I'm Inuk. Like, I remember that being like a really big thing, even in my community. And like I said, I knew I was Black, but it wasn't something that I was just proud of who I was, you know, and it's not really something I had thought about. But I do remember, you know, being really young and kids making fun of my hair and everybody, you know, touching my hair and kind of being that like, oh wow, like she's, you know, she's like, where's, oh well, who's her dad? Like being like people being really nosy and asking questions about that. And I think that it wasn't until I moved to Ontario that I had a huge identity crisis, and I was only like 9 or 10 years old. And I think at that time it's so hard to kind of, you don't even understand yourself in this world, and identity is just something that just, I don't even think like a 9 or 10-year-old fully is able to grasp when it's being taken away from them. I'll never forget it. I think it was my first or second week of school. I was talking to one of my teachers, and she asked me a question, and I kind of raised my eyebrows. You know, how Inuit communicate with each other, which meant yes. And she told me to stop talking like a baby in front of the entire class. And I had never felt like so shamed, like so ashamed in my life. Like I just felt really embarrassed, I guess. And I remember kids were laughing, and she even sent a note home and told my parents that I need to start communicating more. And so I think ever since then, it was like, hey, this world is not going to adapt to me. Like I need to adapt. And my way of adapting with all of these extremely like ignorant teachers and educators who clearly saw where I came from. On my transcript, it says where I came from. But because they saw me as being a mixed child, as presumably for them, it was like, oh, she's mixed and like white and Black. They didn't really attend to, you know, the huge culture shock that I was undergoing. Like I had never seen a building over like 4 stories before. Like this was like, it was like another world. Like I almost felt like I wasn't even in the same country. Because I remember saying that to my family. Like I was like, this doesn't even seem like Canada. Like I just remember feeling like I wasn't even in the same country. And so I think like as a child, like it was really traumatic for me. And my response to that trauma was either growing up when people would ask me, you know, what's your background? Like, what's your background? Kind of making it digestible for folks and just saying, oh, I'm Native and Black. Because Native is what people understand. And as soon as you say you're Inuk, oh, so you're Eskimo. And then we got to go through all of that. And it's just like the labor of that, being so young, I couldn't do it. It was just so hard for me. And then also unpacking, you know, I remember the 1-2 lesson that we did have in class. Inuit and suicide and this and this and that. And just being ashamed, like, oh my gosh, like, you know, coming into myself, like just realizing some of the issues in my community and feeling really like embarrassed. And so between the ages of like, I also like didn't have anybody to speak Inuit to it with. Like, you know, I became ashamed of my grandmother. Like it was really bad. I became like a super depressed kid. And then, but I also lived with my grandparents when I moved to Toronto too, and my Guyanese grandparents. And I think that I clung on to that culture so much because it was the closest, something that was comforting to me, and the closest thing, and it was my grandparents, you know, and the closest thing that reminded me of my grandparents. Mind you, I had never been around my Guyanese family up until this point. And I just remember going through school and just not telling anybody who I was. So I kind of flew under the radar. And I was kind of under the radar until I was in high school. And I remember talking to my anansi, like, this is when around like right after the 2008 apology came out, and she had told me that she didn't get an apology because she was from Labrador and like all the politics around that. And her saying to me, like, you know, Jaelyn, I was really ashamed to even going out in public with my mother. And her just telling me how ashamed she was of her family. And I think at that moment, I was like, I want to get away as far away from the suburbs of Toronto as I possibly can, because like I'm losing who I am, and I'm hearing what happened to my grandmother. And this is literally like mirroring what happened to her. And so when I had gone to university, it was like I had like this existential crisis. Like I was just so confused because I identified so much with Inuit, but I was so afraid to go in those spaces because I was so afraid of the of being questioned, you know? And whereas for me, being around my West Indian, my Afro Guyanese, Afro Trini, Afro Jamaican kin, that was easier. It was easier for me for a while until, you know, I started to kind of come into a lot of these spaces here. Like we have a lot of there's a huge oh baby there's a huge Inuit community in Ottawa, and I think like once I started to kind of come into these spaces, it was easier. Also, like I have a lot of family who are known here, but at the same time, I think trying to balance the two was just so confusing, and it didn't come out so much in my relationships, but more so in like I internalized it all, and it became like it came out as depression, it came out as drinking, it came out as smoking, and things like that to cope with like I think the balance of what that was, and not really having support because I didn't find a community of people who really understood until I think my latter years of university. I'm just gonna stop because he's upset.
Yeah, I feel like I connect with a lot of that. I think, you know, early on in reconnecting, you know, I was really, really proud to finally feel free enough to be Black and Muskogee. Like I felt, especially because it made my grandmother proud, because she said to me, I'm really happy because I didn't think that you wanted to be Native. And I didn't think that you were happy to be Indian. And I was like, grandmother, like that hurt my heart to hear her say that that's what she thought, because that hadn't been the case. It just meant, like I didn't have the language to be both Black and Native. Like I didn't know what that meant. And I, being, geographically and culturally separated, there wasn't a way for me other than the little things that my dad and my mom would do to remind me. My dad would always say, "Your creek," and my mom would buy really, hideous, cheap things that were just kind of pan-Indigenous, like paintings and things that I was just like, oh goodness, I'm not letting anybody come to our house and see that. But now I realize that was even my mom's way of like seeing me, seeing my my indigeneity and being proud of that for me. And my dad would go to Oklahoma every year without us because it was it was expensive to try to take 5 kids and a whole family back to Oklahoma. And so every year my dad would go back and I would see this and I'd just be like, okay, that's Oklahoma. But now that I'm older, I'm doing the same thing. And now I get it. Like I get that. And so I think that reconnecting has been scary sometimes because I have wanted to be palatable. Like a lot of you have said, like all of you have said, be palatable and digestible to people and like make sure I have my pedigree in order so that when people ask me, what's your tribal town and who are your peoples? And I could just like list from contact to now everybody, right? Make sure I have all that in order. And instead of that being, something I was doing to prove myself, it should have just been something that I was doing to enjoy. I definitely enjoyed it, but it's like that gets taken away from us because we're also Black. And it's like, this is just our papers, like our travel papers, right? Like, we're okay to travel through indigeneity because we got it all, listed. And here's my blood quantum to prove. And, oh, the reason why my blood quantum isn't as high as this is because they erased my other Black ancestors. It's like all these things that we have to do to perform indigeneity, to perform that, to make ourselves worthy of being seen as also, Native, especially if you didn't grow up in community, right? That there's another extra layer of like, you're not enough. You're thin blood or I had somebody said, oh, but you're just a newbie. Like, that's what we call you guys. So you guys are just the newbies. And it's like, never do you want to drop kick somebody so bad, right? It's so I think like there's this pressure to perform nativeness, like Kiesha said, like buy the earrings, learn how to bead, how many ribbon skirts do you have? can you introduce yourself in your language? You know, all these things that kind of really, when people are anti-Black, will never be enough anyway, right? And so I think that I've had to learn how to, instead of doing them to prove myself, do them because I'm Native, right? I do this because this is my inheritance. This is my birthright. And I have learned, you know, especially speaking out loud about it, that people are going to be violent and they're going to say anything they can to kind of bring you down a notch. And I made a post once after somebody was saying that I wasn't even Native. Like their argument was, she's not even Native. She grew up in Los Angeles and Washington, as if there aren't Native people in Los Angeles and Washington, but whatever. And I've never grown up in Washington, so I don't know what that means. But I put up all of my like ID cards to just as a joke, like, okay, so which one of these would make me worthy enough in your eyes? And the real answer is none of them, right? None of this would make me enough for you to see me as your equal. But what I'm learning is people are so distracted by their anti-Blackness and their dislike for us, especially those of us who speak up to it, that they're not doing the real work of, you know, dismantling the system. They're trying to dismantle us and say, you belong in this box, right? You belong over here. You're not even, and I've had people say, but your phenotypes are more African, so you're just African. As if being just African is a problem. Like, I would be proud to be just African if I was, but I am worthy of my Blackness and my indigeneity. Like, that's not something you can take from me, even if you dislike me. My identity is rooted in, like I said, the people I come from, and the fact that my grandmother is proud of me for loving being Native, right? For embracing this. So I think, yeah, like navigating this stuff takes so much of like weeding out, what am I doing for other people? And what am I doing because I'm Native and because I'm Black, right? Like, how am I performing Nativeness? How am I performing Blackness? And it's not my responsibility to be palatable for people, but that's hard because we're human, right? And there are, you know, I know for me, like, I'm trying to have these very nuanced conversations with like one-liners on Instagram and Twitter. And we know that there's so much more complexity to it, but it's like, unless you like cut up these things into small pieces and slowly feed them to people, they don't understand. Like you know, yeah, I just feel like I'm learning not to perform. And that is a constant battle. That is something that I have to be aware of. And I have to, there are times where I feel like I have to be okay with risking people rejecting me for being true to what I believe. You know, I'm feeling that way right now around our freedmen issue, is that I know that people are going to reject me as I say Black freedmen are, Muskogee freedmen are kin. I know that there are real consequences to that. I know that that could affect my reconnecting journey. It might make it harder, right? And yet, these are kin. Like, I'm not willing to reject them the way that people are willing to reject me, you know, because I'm also Black, or because my phenotype doesn't look, you know, Muskogee or whatever, you know. Yeah, I often feel like I'm gonna have to be a martyr. And I hate that. I hate not just getting to be, you know, both Black and Native. So I think I push back on it and I just say, my grandmother says she's proud of me, and that's where I leave it.
I just want to say a couple of things quick, because I feel like you really said things that just like hit the mark for me around the fact of like having all of your ancestors, like you can list them all. I find it so interesting that like all of these white pretendians that like it's coming out about them, they're like, oh, I didn't research my family, this is just stories. But it's like the fact that you were able to last so long, when like every single time I'm talking to someone, I make a point to say which family I belong to. Like, I make a point to be like, I'm a Dularan, I'm a Brissette, I'm a Hirondelle. So you know, so you can't sit there and deny my indigeneity. And I just find it so interesting that, like, as Afro-Indigenous folks, we automatically, like, yeah, a lot of us do it for fun, but we automatically have that list in the back of our minds because we're ready for the moment that someone questions our identity in a way in which, like, white folks, they're like, yeah, I've been in the field for 25 years. What do you mean you're just asking me about my family ancestry now? Meanwhile, like, we've had to know from day one. So I just, like, I find that so interesting. That, and then when you had talked about, like, the buying our beadwork and all of that stuff, I'll never forget when I bought, and I feel like a lot of folks who are, like, reconnecting do this. I bought one of the beaded chokers, but I specifically got, like, like, it was, like, it literally was from a regalia, and I would wear that shit, like, it made sense to wear it to class. Like, I really was wearing that on my everyday life. And I remember because I was just like, I need people to see me as Native. So I was buying literally, like, Pow Wow regalia to wear in my everyday life. And it just didn't make sense. And I know people were looking at me like, what is wrong with this girl? But it's really something that I was doing because I just wanted people to be like, oh, she's Native. She's got her beadwork on. Of course she's Native, right? But it's like, it's the fact that we tell ourselves, like, that's what being Indigenous is like having our beadwork on, having those ribbon skirts. Like, that's not what being Anishinaabe is. Because first of all, we didn't have all of this stuff prior to colonization. So how does that make me more or less Anishinaabe? And then I also just think about the fact, like what you said about folks being kin, is that, like, if colonization didn't happen and Anishinaabe, like specifically for my nation, Anishinaabe folks would have had the same territory that they had. When people moved to our territory, they would have become Anishinaabe. Like, we adopted people in. And so for me, I find it so interesting in the way in which we disconnect ourselves from people, because at the end of the day, like, Anishinaabe as nation, like saying I'm Anishinaabe, that's my nationhood. It'd be the equivalent of saying I'm Canadian. And yet somehow we disconnect people who are raised within our nations, who are raised within our communities, as not being of us, despite the fact that prior to colonization, the moment they started living in our communities, they would have been us. Like, so I find that interesting what you said, the way in which, like, we disconnect ourselves from folks who belong in our communities because of simply the fact that they look different. But prior to colonization, that's not something that happened. That's how you have OG Cree people. That's how you have, for instance, the Haudenosaunee adopting the Tuscarora and becoming the Sixth Nation, right? Like, it's fun. I just find it interesting that we forget that like we forget a lot of our nations are in relationship with each other because we decided to adopt each other. We decided to come together. Like, Anishinaabe makes up 7 confederacies. Those were 7 distinct nations that decided to become kin, right? But, like, somehow we've forgotten about that. So I just wanted to add that quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many great things that are being said right now. I can definitely relate. Like, every Indigenous space I went to within Toronto, I always had, my status card in my pocket in case somebody would question me of my identity, which is colonial in itself, which is super colonial. But yeah, just like anticipating that I'm going to be met with somebody who's going to question my identity because I'm visibly Black, because I'm Black. There's honestly so many great things to talk about, but I just want to move on to the final question. If anybody else has anything to add, but the final question is: what does Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism, and Afro-Indigenous futurism mean to you? Okay, so, well, for me, I feel like futurism has to include what, Shanese was saying. It has to include, our nation going back to the way that we, would govern and see ourselves before, like adopting folks who are on our traditional territories into our nations, practicing our laws. And for me, it's also like really important to see that also in like migrant justice movements, like adopting like migrants, people who fear their lives because of like the threat of deportation, adopting them on our lands and being like, these people, are kin and deserve to be here as well. And I feel like that's very important. Like, that's something I've been like, thinking about for the past several years. Like, how do we do that? How do we form treaties with like migrant people so that they can be on our lands and that the settler colonial state cannot deport them? and also Afro-Indigenous futurism for me is like making sure that, you know, our kin in the future don't have to struggle with the things that we struggle with now. I feel like that's what's really important for me, like to normalize our identities enough so that nobody else has to really struggle with that moving forward. Yeah, I think that's all I have.
That 1,000%. Like what you said about like migrants being able to be taken in on our lands, like that is something that was historically done. Like when we think about slavery on these lands, like yes, there were some nations that owned slaves, we know this, but there were also a lot of nations that helped to hide folks, that brought folks into communities, like the Tuscaroras that I just talked about. The Tuscarora Nation is known for the fact that they used to take in runaway slaves and give them names and give them clans and incorporate them into community to hide them and keep them safe. Like that is something that our nations have done. And so I just love the idea of that, of like, hi, I'd like to apply for refugee like status in Nipissing First Nation. Like how dope would that be? Like I think that's such a beautiful thing. And I think, yeah, for like Afro-Indigenous futurism, what that looks like to me is that it looks like us being able to simply be, like to simply live, to survive, like not survive. I don't want to survive anymore. I just want to live. Like, and I think like when we think of like futurism, right, whether it's Black, like Afrofuturism or Indigenous futurism or both, like we think it has to be these big grand things that we think of, and I think that's what a lot of us get caught up in. Like we're trying to sit here and write like an episode of the Jetsons, like there's going to be flying cars with like native flags on them. Like I think that's like what we get stuck in our heads, but like it can be simple as like being able to just live. Like the fact that I can't live in my community because I don't have status, despite the fact that like I talk to my elders every week and I have such a strong, like I want to be able to simply, with my nation inviting me to come and live there, go and live in my community. I want that. And I think a lot of us don't have access to that, to simply be able to live in community. And even when we do have status, like just having access to community, like I want to see that. I want to see us being able to like thrive. I want to see, you know, Afro-Indigenous chiefs. Like we have, like we talk about, oh, there's only like the first woman to be a chief. Who's the first Afro-Indigenous person to be a chief? I would love to know that, because I personally don't know. I don't know if there's ever been someone on these territories. You know what I'm saying? So like, I remember when I was in university, I was the first Afro-Indigenous person to become president of my student union, and we had been around for over 50 years. And that's the Native Student Union. Like, the fact that it took over 50 years for there to be an Afro-Indigenous president, like why? Right? And so like for me, like that's what I would like to think of. I would like I would like to see us just being able to be like, I met this really amazing elder the other day. And when I met her, I was talking to her, and I started to realize like we had a lot of connections. And she had shared with me that her husband was Jamaican and her children were Afro-Indigenous. And they had been married. She was 80. They had been married for 64 years. 64 years. This Anishinaabe woman who was married to a Jamaican man. Like when you think about that, is wild. And we don't have stories of that. Like, I don't care about, what's that movie, the one about the darlings, Love Darling or whatever, the one about the interracial white couple in the States. Like, I want to know about Afro-Indigenous folks from 60 years ago. I want to know about the relationships that we've had from 60 years ago. Like, so also like the Lovings. Yeah, the Lovings. I was like, the darlings. I knew it was something, the Lovings. But yeah, like, Afrofuturism for me also looks like us knowing our past. Like and especially within a Canadian context, like we don't have stories of like Black folks and Indigenous folks on our lands being in a relationship to each other. We don't. It's not like in the United States where there's like whole books written about it, and we're talking about buffalo soldiers and how that affected the land and all of these things. We don't have that in Canada. And like, for me, I think that's wild that we don't even know our history, don't even know our relationship to each other on our own lands, right? And I also want to know our relationships past just slavery. Like, I want to know, like, what kinships we built, like, what traditions have we shared with each other? Like, when you're telling me that runaway slaves were escaping onto reses, you can't tell me that they didn't bring cultural practices that were then adopted by community members. So for me, it's like also figuring out, okay, what's indigenous to these lands, what's indigenous to the African continent, how did it form within this nation? So like for me, it looks a lot like looking at the past to go into the future, and like just being able to live and be us and survive, thrive. Like that's what I want to see for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that is what I'm thinking. I think I do want to move into thrivance. I really am thinking about the ways in which people get to exist as humans. Like I'm always thinking about that, and how for a long time I think Black and Indigenous peoples, our humanity hasn't been allowed to be realized, right? And then I think that has caused a lot of contention between our two peoples, right? Because we're fighting for the intention of the settler state. And so when I think about the future, I think about the ways in which we get to celebrate like our humanity, but also celebrate like our nationhoods, our individual nations, our sovereign nations, working together. I mean, working, like seeing each other as independent sovereign nations that can coexist, right? I think that we don't really stop and think about the past, where we did have these sovereign nations that our geographies and our politics weren't like these really strict lines, right? Like people overlapped. People understood each other differently, like outside these colonial systems. Like I want us to know who we are outside of these systems. I want us to imagine who we could be outside of these systems. And yeah, I think about the ways in which, again, I think that non-Black Indigenous folks have to grow into maturity of seeing Black folks as Indigenous too, right? Indigenous peoples, descendants of Indigenous peoples of Africa. And I think that until people can recognize that indigeneity, they will still see us through the lens of settler colonialism and white supremacy. And so I think that it's going to take us to really start to think outside of colonialism and white supremacy. And I think that's really hard to do because we've all been conditioned to see that way and to think that way. And to also value these systems, to feel like we can't be without them. Like we won't be able to thrive. We won't be able to manage our lands. We won't be able to relearn our languages, right? Like there's all these things that people have, like, they put white supremacy and settler colonialism on an altar, as this is the pinnacle of human existence and human, societies. And I think that Afrofuturism, Afro-Indigenous futurism, Indigenous futurism is a refusal of that, right? It's a refusal of like believing that we have arrived. Because we were already there prior to this. Like for me, this is us going backwards in a lot of ways. And so for me, the future isn't unrealistic though. Like you were talking about, Shanese, it's not this, we're not going to create some magical kumbaya place, right? Like there are going to be problems in the future, and that is okay. And I think that we feel like we have to either replicate this system, have, capitalism, have prisons, have, all these things that we currently have in order to feel successful, right? In order to feel like we reach some kind of like, I don't know, civilization. But I think returning to understanding the land and being in community with non-human relatives, like those things are valuable, right? Like, so it's gonna take us to like really sit down and decide what's valuable to us. And it doesn't mean that everything that we are participating in now has to go away, because I think that we should celebrate being dynamic, right? And I think that we don't have to be stuck in some idea of the past in order to be who we are. I definitely think traditions and ceremony, like they are necessary. But I think that in the cases where there may be traditions, even if they're newly formed traditions that are racist or homophobic or ableist, if those things exist now, they gotta go, right? Like, so I think that, yeah, it's something that we don't have to like decide in one, you know, like we're not gonna have a conference and sit down and say, this is how it's gonna be. Like these things are gonna be ever evolving. But I do think that we should be okay with being dynamic. I think it's okay for us to adopt new ideas and new traditions. It's okay to bring people into our tribes and our nations as kin. Because like, you know, Shanice, like we all been saying, like in the past, we did these things, right? These are indigenous practices that aren't new. And so, yeah, like I just want us to be okay with being dynamic, and I want us to be okay with learning as we go. I don't think perfection is required of us. And I think that that's sometimes what we get so stuck on. Like we have to figure this out right now and it has to be perfect. It's more that we just need to start practicing, because empires do fall and this will fall. And if we're not prepared, if we haven't started to practice the things that we say we want, we will just end up replicating the same system. And that's my biggest fear, is that that's what we're doing right now, is replicating the system we're in. And I don't want this. Like, you know, Kiesha said, I don't want this for our kids. I don't want, you know, Afro-Indigenous kids to have to, you know, question whether they're worthy of their Blackness and their indigeneity. And I don't want non-Black Native kids to put that on, you know, Black Native kids, right? Like this is work we all have to do. So at this point, I'm rambling because I don't have an exact answer. I just want us to have grace with ourselves, and I want us to start practicing the things that we actually value.